You think you know what hell looks like. Maybe it's fire and brimstone, maybe it's endless desert heat, or the frozen trenches of the Somme. But for the men of the 28th Infantry Division in November 1944, hell had a very specific address: the Hürtgen Forest, Germany. A place so nightmarish that hardened veterans who had survived D-Day would break down crying at the mere mention of its name. But what if I told you that the most devastating single day in this green hell wasn't caused by superior German tactics or overwhelming firepower? What if the real tragedy was born from a single well-intentioned lie? A promise made by a good man trying to keep hope alive in the face of certain doom? This is the story of November 16, 1944. The day Sergeant Elias Vance looked into the terrified eyes of his squad of teenage replacements and made a promise he couldn't possibly keep: nobody is going to die today. By sunset, that promise would become the cruelest irony in a war already drowning in them. Because what Vance didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Hill 400 wasn't just another objective. It was a carefully orchestrated trap, designed by one of Germany's most brilliant tactical minds to turn American optimism into American graves. Stay with me, because the story you're about to hear will shatter everything you think you know about courage, leadership, and the true cost of hope in wartime. This isn't just another war story. This is a dissection of how good intentions can become the deadliest weapons of all. Picture this. It's 5:47 a.m., November 16th, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest is a cathedral of death, its towering fir trees so thick they block out the sky, creating a perpetual twilight that seeps into men's souls like poison. For 3 weeks, the 28th Infantry Division, Pennsylvania's own National Guard unit, nicknamed the Bloody Bucket, has been grinding through this nightmare, losing men by the hundreds for gains measured in yards. The forest itself is the enemy. Artillery shells don't just explode here. They turn the massive trees into wooden shrapnel bombs that can decapitate a man from 50 yards away. Machine gun nests are invisible until they open fire. Their muzzle flashes the last thing countless American boys ever see. The constant rain has turned every foxhole into a muddy grave, and the cold is so brutal that men's rifles freeze in their hands, leaving them defenseless when the moment of truth arrives. But it's not just the physical environment that's killing them. It's the psychological warfare of fighting an enemy you can't see in a place that seems designed by Satan himself to break the human spirit. Every step forward could trigger a mine. Every shadow could hide a sniper. Every sound could be your last warning before a mortar round turns you into red mist. Sergeant Elias Vance crouches in what used to be a German bunker, studying a rain-soaked map by the light of a dying cigarette. The bunker still smells of cordite and death, its concrete walls scarred by shrapnel and stained with blood that could belong to either side. At 29, he's ancient by infantry standards. North Africa, Sicily, Normandy. He's survived them all through a combination of skill, luck, and an almost supernatural ability to read the battlefield like other men read newspapers. Vance has the kind of weathered face that belongs in a museum exhibit about the cost of war. Deep lines around his eyes from squinting through smoke and dust. A scar across his left cheek from a piece of German steel that missed his jugular by millimeters. Hands that shake slightly when he thinks no one is looking, not from fear, but from the accumulated stress of keeping other people's children alive in a world designed to kill them. His men worship him because in a war where most squad leaders last about 2 weeks, Vance has kept more soldiers alive than anyone has a right to expect. He's the kind of leader who remembers everyone's hometown, everyone's girl back home, everyone's dreams for after the war. He writes letters to the families of the boys who don't make it, telling them their sons died heroes, even when they died screaming for their mothers in a muddy hole. But this morning, looking at the faces around him, Vance sees something that chills him more than the November cold: complete, soul-crushing despair. His squad isn't really his squad anymore. The original Pennsylvania boys, the ones he'd trained with, laughed with, bled with, they're mostly gone now. Jimmy Kowalski from Pittsburgh, who could make anyone laugh even in the worst situations, caught a sniper's bullet through the throat 2 weeks ago. Bobby Jen from Philadelphia, who carried pictures of his little sister everywhere, stepped on a mine and simply vanished in a cloud of pink mist. Danny Morrison from Scranton, who'd been planning to marry his high school sweetheart when he got home, died calling her name while his intestines spilled into the German mud. What Vance has instead are replacements. Kids, really. 18, 19 years old, pulled straight from basic training and thrown into this meat grinder, with barely enough time to learn each other's names. They arrive wide-eyed and eager, full of propaganda about American superiority and the righteousness of their cause. Within hours, that eagerness turns to terror. Within days, the terror becomes a kind of walking death that's almost worse than the real thing. There's Private Tommy Morrison, a farm boy from Ohio whose hands shake so badly he can barely hold his rifle. He'd volunteered the day after Pearl Harbor, full of righteous anger and patriotic fervor. Now he flinches at every sound, jumps at every shadow, and hasn't slept more than an hour at a time in 3 weeks. His letters home, when he can bring himself to write them, are exercises in creative fiction, describing a war that bears no resemblance to the hell he's actually living through. Private Jake Kowalski from Detroit, no relation to the Pittsburgh Kowalski who died earlier, hasn't spoken a word since watching his foxhole partner get cut in half by tree shrapnel 3 days ago. He just stares at nothing with 1,000-yard eyes, mechanically cleaning his rifle over and over again, with the obsessive precision of a man trying to maintain control over the one thing in his life that still makes sense. Private Danny Chen, a Chinese-American kid from San Francisco who volunteered to prove his patriotism after years of being called a yellow Jap by his neighbors, carries himself with the desperate dignity of someone who knows he has to be twice as brave as everyone else just to be considered half as American. He'd been studying to be an engineer before the war, dreaming of building bridges and skyscrapers. Now, he builds nothing but shallow graves for his fallen comrades. Private Bobby Davis from Montana, barely 18, still has acne and the kind of innocent face that belongs on a Norman Rockwell painting, not in a German forest. He'd lied about his age to enlist, adding 2 years to his birth certificate, with the clumsy forgery of a boy who'd never broken a rule in his life until the war gave him a reason to. Private Mike Johnson from Texas, who'd been the star quarterback of his high school football team, keeps talking about the plays he's going to run when he gets back home, as if football still matters in a world where your best friend can be there 1 second and gone the next. His optimism is both heartbreaking and infuriating to the men who've been here longer. These aren't soldiers. They're scared children wearing uniforms too big for their bodies and carrying weapons too heavy for their souls. They've been in the Hürtgen Forest for exactly 6 days, and already Vance can see the war eating them alive from the inside out. The objective for today seems almost insultingly simple after weeks of horror: Hill 400. It's not even really a hill, more like a slight rise in the forest floor, maybe 150 feet higher than the surrounding terrain. On a map, it looks like nothing. In reality, it's a strategic nightmare that's been chewing up American units for weeks. The brass wants it because it overlooks a crossroads that the Germans have been using to move supplies and reinforcements. Take the hill, control the crossroads, and maybe, just maybe, this nightmare in the forest can finally end. At least that's what the officers back at division headquarters keep telling themselves as they move pins around on maps that bear no resemblance to the reality on the ground. But Vance has been studying that hill for 3 days now, and everything about it screams trap. The approaches are too obvious, the defensive positions too well concealed, the German resistance too organized. This isn't the desperate last-ditch fighting of a beaten enemy. This is something else entirely. "Listen up," Vance says, his voice cutting through the morning mist like a blade. The boys gather around him, their young faces pale and hollow in the dim light filtering through the canopy above. They move with the careful, deliberate motions of men who've learned that sudden movements can be fatal, that in the Hürtgen Forest, the difference between life and death often comes down to whether you step on the right patch of ground. Vance looks at each of them, these children who should be worrying about homework and girls and whether they'll make the baseball team. Instead, they're here, in this green hell, waiting for him to tell them how they're going to survive the next few hours. The weight of their trust is almost unbearable. They look at him like he's some kind of magician who can pull safety out of thin air, who can make sense of a world that has gone completely insane. He forces a smile, the kind of smile that costs a piece of your soul every time you fake it. It's a skill he's learned over 3 years of war: how to project confidence you don't feel, how to give hope when you have none left to give. "We take that hill, and we get pulled back for a hot meal. Stick with me, do exactly as I say." He pauses, letting his eyes meet each of theirs, trying to pour every ounce of his experience and determination into that gaze. Nobody is going to die today. The relief that washes over their faces is immediate and heartbreaking. For the first time in days, Some of them actually smile back. Morrison stops shaking, his hands steadying on his rifle. Kowalski nods slowly, the first sign of life he's shown since his partner died. Chen straightens his shoulders just a little, and Davis actually grins with the uncomplicated joy of a boy who still believes his sergeant can work miracles. Vance has just given them the most precious gift a leader can offer in wartime: hope. The belief that maybe, just maybe, they'll see another sunrise. That their mothers will get letters from them instead of from the War Department. That their girlfriends will have someone to marry when this is all over. That their dreams of college and careers and families aren't just fantasies that will die in the German mud. But even as he says the words, Vance feels them stick in his throat like broken glass. Because he knows what these boys don't. That in war, hope can be the most dangerous emotion of all. It makes you careless. It makes you take risks you shouldn't take. It makes you believe that courage and determination can overcome superior firepower and better positioning. Pity that wasn't true. What Sergeant Vance didn't know, what the entire American command structure didn't know, was that Hill 400 had been under the watchful eye of Oberst Heinrich Braun for the past 2 weeks. And Heinrich Braun was not your average German officer. While his peers were still fighting the last war, obsessed with grand offensive maneuvers and blitzkrieg tactics that had worked so brilliantly in Poland and France, Braun had evolved. He understood that the war had changed, that the days of lightning advances and crushing victories were over. Now it was about attrition, about making the enemy pay such a terrible price for every yard that they would eventually lose the will to continue. Braun had been studying the Americans since Normandy, and he'd reached some disturbing conclusions about their tactical doctrine. They were brave, stupidly, admirably brave, but they were also predictable. They believed in frontal assaults, in overwhelming firepower, in the idea that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. They fought like men who'd read too many stories about the last war, where heroes charged machine gun nests and won through sheer force of will. More importantly, they fought like men who expected to survive. European armies had learned through bitter experience that survival was a luxury you couldn't count on, that every attack might be your last. But Americans still believed in happy endings, still thought that being the good guys meant they were destined to win. It was both their greatest strength and their most exploitable weakness. From his command post 3 miles behind the lines, Braun had been watching the Americans' slow, bloody advance, with the patience of a spider studying flies in its web. He knew they would come for Hill 400 eventually. It was too strategically valuable to ignore. And when they did, he would be ready with a lesson in the new reality of warfare. Braun had spent weeks preparing his masterpiece. The hill itself was a killing field, ringed with carefully concealed machine gun nests positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. But the real genius was in what you couldn't see, a network of underground tunnels that allowed his men to move unseen, appearing and disappearing like ghosts in the forest. Sniper positions that could be occupied and abandoned in minutes. Artillery observers hidden in trees that looked dead but weren't. Every approach to the hill had been studied, every possible avenue of attack anticipated and prepared for. Braun had even brought in specialists from the Eastern Front, men who'd learned the art of defensive warfare in the hell of Stalingrad and the killing fields of Kursk. They'd taught his men how to turn every tree, every rock, every fold in the ground into a weapon. But Braun's real innovation was psychological. He understood that the key to breaking American units wasn't just killing their bodies, it was killing their hope. Americans could endure tremendous casualties if they believed they were making progress, if they thought their sacrifices meant something. But if you could convince them that their efforts were futile, that their leaders were sending them to die for nothing, they would break faster than any European army. So Braun had designed his trap not just to kill Americans, but to do it in a way that would destroy the morale of every unit that heard about it. He wanted survivors, traumatized, broken survivors who would spread the word about what happened to brave men who trusted their sergeant's promises. At 6:15 a.m., Vance's squad begins their approach to Hill 400. The forest is eerily quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of war, distant artillery, sporadic rifle fire, the rumble of tanks, have faded to an unnatural silence that makes every footstep sound like thunder. Even the birds have stopped singing, as if they sense what's coming. "Something's not right," whispers Private Morrison, his earlier confidence already evaporating like morning mist. His farm boy instincts, honed by years of reading weather patterns and animal behavior, are screaming warnings that his military training hasn't taught him to interpret. Vance feels it too. In 3 years of combat, he's developed an almost supernatural sense for danger, and right now every instinct is screaming at him to turn around, to call off the attack, to find some excuse to delay until they can get better intelligence. But orders are orders, and his boys are counting on him. More importantly, he's just promised them that nobody will die today, and backing down now would destroy what little confidence they have left. They move forward in a loose formation, Vance in the lead, his experienced eyes scanning the forest for threats. The undergrowth is thick here, perfect for concealment. Every shadow could hide a sniper. Every fallen log could conceal a machine gun nest. Every innocent-looking patch of ground could be mined. The trees themselves seem malevolent, their branches reaching down like gnarled fingers, trying to snatch the life from passing soldiers. The constant drip of condensation from the canopy above sounds like a countdown timer, marking off the seconds until something terrible happens. At 6:43 a.m., they reach the base of Hill 400. The slope ahead of them looks deceptively peaceful. Just another stretch of forest, indistinguishable from the thousands of acres they've already fought through. But Vance's gut is telling him this is wrong, all wrong. The silence is too complete, the positioning too perfect, the whole setup too convenient. "Sarge," Chen whispers, pointing to something in the trees ahead. "You see that?" Vance follows his gaze and spots it. A thin wire, barely visible, stretched between 2 trees about 50 yards up the slope. A tripwire. But here's the thing that makes his blood run cold. It's too obvious. Any competent soldier would spot it from this distance. It's the kind of amateur mistake that German engineers stopped making in 1940. It's bait. Braun, watching through binoculars from his concealed position, allows himself a thin smile. The Americans have taken the bait, just as he knew they would. They're thinking tactically, not strategically. They see the obvious trap and believe they can avoid it, never realizing that the obvious trap is designed to funnel them exactly where he wants them. This is the fundamental difference between European and American military thinking, Braun reflects. Europeans have learned to assume that every move the enemy makes is part of a larger plan, that every apparent mistake is actually a carefully calculated deception. Americans still believe that their enemies make genuine errors, that superior training and equipment can overcome superior cunning. "We go around," Vance decides, leading his squad to the left, away from the tripwire. It's the smart play, the safe play, the play that any experienced sergeant would make. It's exactly what Braun is counting on. As they circle around the obvious trap, Vance's squad is unknowingly walking into a much more sophisticated one. Braun has anticipated their route, prepared for their caution, turned their experience against them. The path they're taking feels natural, feels safe, feels like the kind of tactical decision that will keep them alive. In reality, it's leading them directly into the killing zone. The German machine gunners, hidden in their carefully camouflaged positions, watch the Americans approach with professional interest. These aren't the same kind of soldiers they'd faced in Normandy. Those had been veterans, men who moved with the careful precision of those who'd learned to respect the enemy's capabilities. These are replacements, boys who still believe that being American makes them invincible. At 7:02 a.m. they step into the kill zone. The first shot comes from nowhere and everywhere at once. Private Morrison, the farm boy from Ohio, who just wanted to make it home to help with the spring planting, drops without a sound, a sniper's bullet through his heart. One moment he's there, whispering about how quiet everything is, and the next he's just another body in the German mud. "Contact!" Vance screams, but his voice is immediately drowned out by the roar of machine guns opening up from 3 different directions. The carefully positioned nests create a crossfire that turns the forest floor into a storm of lead and splinters. The sound is indescribable, not just the mechanical chatter of the guns, but the screaming of bullets through air, the crack of wood as rounds tear through trees, the wet thud of metal meeting flesh. Kowalski dives behind a fallen log and immediately realizes his mistake. It's not cover, it's a funnel. The Germans have positioned their guns to make this log seem like safety, while actually creating a perfect target zone. He tries to move, but the machine gun fire is too intense, too precise. Every time he lifts his head, bullets snap past close enough to part his hair. Chen, the kid from San Francisco who volunteered to prove his loyalty, makes it exactly 12 feet before a burst from an MG-42 cuts him down. The German machine gun, firing at 200 rounds per minute, doesn't just kill him, it destroys him, turning his body into something that barely resembles human form. He falls face first into the mud, his rifle spinning away into the undergrowth, his dreams of building bridges and proving his patriotism dying with him. This isn't a battle, it's an execution. Vance realizes with crystalline clarity that they've walked into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. Every element has been planned, every angle calculated, every possible escape route anticipated and blocked. The Germans aren't just shooting at them, they're herding them, controlling their movement, turning their own survival instincts against them. "Fall back," he screams, but there's nowhere to fall back to. The machine gun nests have been positioned to cut off their retreat, forcing them forward into an even more deadly killing field. It's a masterpiece of tactical planning, and Vance can't help but admire it, even as it kills his men. Private Johnson, a quiet kid from Montana who'd been planning to be a teacher after the war, tries to follow Vance's order. He makes it 3 steps before a hidden sniper puts a bullet through his spine. He falls, paralyzed but conscious, and begins screaming for his mother in a voice that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The sound cuts through the gunfire like a knife, a reminder that these aren't just soldiers dying, they're someone's children. Davis, the baby-faced kid from Montana, tries to return fire, but can't even see what he's shooting at. The German positions are too well concealed, too professionally constructed. He's firing at muzzle flashes and shadows, wasting ammunition on targets that might not even be there. Braun watches the slaughter with professional satisfaction. This is warfare as it should be fought, not the crude bludgeoning that has characterized most of this conflict, but a precise surgical dismantling of the enemy's will to fight. Each American death serves a purpose. Each scream of pain sends a message to the others. Your leaders have failed you, your training has failed you, your country has failed you. But Braun isn't a monster, despite what American propaganda might say. He's a soldier doing his job with devastating efficiency. In his mind, the quicker and more thoroughly he breaks this assault, the fewer of his own men will die. It's a cold calculation, but war is a cold business. Better to be ruthlessly efficient now than to drag out the killing over weeks and months. The machine gun fire intensifies, and Vance realizes that Braun is preparing for the final phase of his trap. The German commander isn't content to simply pin them down. He's going to finish them off with methodical precision, turning Hill 400 into a monument to the futility of American optimism. By 7:15 a.m., Vance's squad of 12 men has been reduced to 4. They're pinned down in a shallow depression that provides minimal cover. Surrounded on 3 sides by machine gun nests they can't see and can't reach, the air above them is thick with bullets, and the ground around them is churned into bloody mud by the constant impact of German steel. Vance looks at the faces of his surviving boys, what's left of them. The hope he'd given them just 2 hours ago has been replaced by something far worse than fear. The terrible understanding that they're going to die here, in this muddy hole in a foreign forest, and there's absolutely nothing their sergeant can do to save them. "You promised," whispers Private Davis, blood running from a shrapnel wound in his scalp. His voice is barely audible over the gunfire, but it cuts through Vance's consciousness like a scream. "You promised nobody would die today." Vance has no answer. What can he say? That he was wrong? That he lied? That sometimes, no matter how much experience you have or how carefully you plan, the enemy is just better prepared? That promises made in wartime are just pretty lies we tell ourselves to make the unbearable bearable. The machine gun fire intensifies, and Vance realizes that Braun is preparing for the final phase of his trap. The German commander isn't content to simply pin them down. He's going to finish them off with methodical precision. At 7:23 a.m., Vance makes the hardest decision of his military career. He keys his radio and calls for artillery on his own position. "Fire mission, danger close," he says, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Grid 847239, fire for effect." The radio operator on the other end hesitates. "Sergeant, that's your position." "I know what it is," Vance replies. "Fire the mission. It's the only way to deny Braun his perfect victory. If they're going to die anyway, at least they can take some Germans with them and prevent other American squads from walking into the same trap. It's the final act of a leader who's run out of options but refuses to let his men die for nothing. The artillery comes screaming in at 7:31 a.m., turning Hill 400 into a moonscape of shattered trees and cratered earth. The machine gun nests are silenced, Braun's carefully constructed trap is obliterated, and the crossroads below remains in German hands. When the smoke clears, there are no survivors from Vance's squad. Not one. The official report, filed 3 days later by a staff officer who'd never been closer to combat than a map room, would list the action at Hill 400 as a tactical reconnaissance that encountered unexpected resistance. 12 men dead for a reconnaissance. The language of war has a way of making tragedy sound routine, of turning human catastrophe into bureaucratic footnotes. But here's what the report didn't say, what the history books would never record, what the families back home would never understand. Sergeant Elias Vance's promise wasn't a lie when he made it. It was hope. Desperate, necessary, beautiful hope in the face of an impossible situation. Vance knew the odds. He'd seen enough combat to understand that Hill 400 was going to be a meat grinder, that the German positions were too strong and too well prepared for a frontal assault by a single squad. He'd read the intelligence reports, studied the aerial photographs, listened to the accounts of other units that had tried and failed to take similar objectives. But he also knew that his boys, these scared, homesick children wearing soldiers' uniforms, needed something to hold on to. They needed to believe that their sergeant, this man who had somehow survived every hell the war had thrown at him, could keep them safe one more time. They needed to believe that their deaths would mean something, that their sacrifices would serve a purpose greater than themselves. So he gave them that belief, even though it cost him a piece of his soul, even though he knew deep down that he was making a promise he might not be able to keep. Because sometimes, in the darkest moments of human experience, hope is more important than truth. The real tragedy of Hill 400 isn't that good men died. Good men had been dying in the Hürtgen Forest for weeks, and they would continue dying long after Vance's squad was forgotten. The tragedy is that hope itself became a weapon that the enemy used against them. Braun's genius wasn't just in his tactical preparation, though that was masterful. It wasn't just in his understanding of American psychology, though that was devastatingly accurate. His real breakthrough was in recognizing that American soldiers fought differently when they believed they were going to survive. They took risks they shouldn't take, made assumptions they shouldn't make, trusted in promises that war had no intention of keeping. European armies had learned through bitter experience to fight like men who expected to die. Every attack was potentially their last. Every decision was made with the assumption that survival was unlikely. This made them cautious, careful, professional in their approach to violence. They fought to accomplish the mission, not to get home alive. But Americans still believed in happy endings. They still thought that being the good guys meant they were destined to win, that courage and determination could overcome superior firepower and better positioning. They fought like men who had families waiting for them, futures to return to, dreams that extended beyond the next few hours. In most situations, this was their greatest strength. American soldiers would attempt assaults that European troops would consider suicidal, would press attacks long after more experienced armies would have withdrawn. Their optimism made them dangerous, unpredictable, willing to take casualties that would break other forces. But in the Hürtgen Forest, against an enemy who understood their psychology and had prepared accordingly, that optimism became their greatest weakness. Braun had turned their hope against them, used their belief in their sergeant's promise to lure them into a trap that a more cynical force might have avoided. In the end, Vance's promise killed his men just as surely as Braun's machine guns did. Not because he was a bad leader, he was one of the best the army had produced, but because in war sometimes love and hope and the desperate desire to protect the people you care about can be the most dangerous weapons of all. The Hürtgen Forest would continue to chew up American divisions for another month before the offensive was finally called off. The 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Bucket, would be so decimated that it would have to be completely rebuilt with fresh troops. Hill 400 would eventually be taken by a different unit, at a cost of hundreds more lives, only to be abandoned a week later when the German winter offensive made the position untenable. The crossroads that had seemed so strategically vital would prove to be just another patch of ground, no more important than the thousands of other patches of ground that men had died for throughout the war. The hill itself would be retaken and lost and retaken again, changing hands like a bloody game of King of the Mountain played with human lives. But on November 16, 1944, In a muddy crater that used to be a forest clearing, the echo of a sergeant's promise hung in the air like smoke from the artillery barrage that had silenced it forever. Nobody is going to die today. Pity that wasn't true. Heinrich Braun would survive the war, returning to a Germany that no longer existed, to a life that had been erased by the very conflict he'd helped to prolong. He would spend his remaining years as a clerk in a small Bavarian town, never speaking of what he'd done in the forest, never acknowledging the tactical brilliance that had cost so many young Americans their lives. In his private moments, in the quiet hours before dawn when old soldiers remember the wars they've fought, Braun would sometimes think about the American sergeant who'd called artillery down on his own position. There had been something admirable about that final gesture, something that transcended nationality and ideology. It was the act of a man who understood that some things were more important than survival. The families of Vance's squad would receive the standard letters, filled with the standard phrases about heroism and sacrifice and the grateful nation. They would be told that their sons had died quickly, painlessly, in service to a cause greater than themselves. Most of these statements would be lies, but they were necessary lies, the kind that let people sleep at night and believe that their loved ones' deaths had meaning. Tommy Morrison's parents would frame his Purple Heart and display it in their farmhouse kitchen, where visitors could see it and know that their boy had been a hero. They would never learn about the promise their son had believed, about the hope that had carried him into the killing zone, about the terror in his eyes in those final moments. Jake Kowalski's mother would keep his last letter, the one where he'd written about how confident he felt with Sergeant Vance leading them, how sure he was that he'd be home for Christmas. She would read it every year on the anniversary of his death, finding comfort in the certainty her son had felt, never knowing how misplaced that certainty had been. Danny Chen's family would face the additional burden of proving their patriotism, of demonstrating that their son's sacrifice had earned them the right to be considered truly American. They would endure the whispers and the sideways glances, the suggestions that maybe their boy had died for a country that would never fully accept him. The lesson here isn't that leaders shouldn't give their people hope. Hope is often the only thing that keeps soldiers moving forward when everything else tells them to run. The lesson is that war is a beast that devours everything we hold sacred. Our innocence, our certainties, our promises, and yes, even our hope. Sergeant Vance died believing he had failed his men. But maybe the real failure was a world that put teenage boys in a position where they needed such promises in the first place. Maybe the real tragedy isn't that one good man couldn't keep 12 young soldiers alive, but that we keep asking good men to make impossible promises in impossible situations. War doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't care about your courage or your training or your love for the men under your command. It doesn't care about the promises you make or the hope you try to kindle in the darkness. War has its own logic, its own rules, its own terrible mathematics that reduce human beings to statistics and turn noble intentions into tragic ironies. In the end, the only promise war ever keeps is that it will break all the others. The only certainty it offers is uncertainty. The only truth it teaches is that there are no guarantees, no matter how desperately we want to believe otherwise. But perhaps that's not the whole story. Perhaps there's something to be said for the fact that Vance made the promise at all, that he was willing to put his own credibility and his men's trust on the line for the chance, however slim, that he might be able to keep them safe. Perhaps there's honor in the attempt, even when the attempt fails. Perhaps the real measure of a leader isn't whether he can keep all his promises, but whether he's willing to make them in the first place. Whether he's willing to give his people something to believe in, even when he knows the odds are against him. Whether he's willing to shoulder the terrible burden of other people's hope, even when that hope might be misplaced. Sergeant Elias Vance made a promise he couldn't keep to boys who deserved better than the world they'd been born into. He gave them hope when hope was all he had to offer. And when that hope proved insufficient, when the promise became impossible to fulfill, he made sure they didn't die alone and forgotten in a German forest. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe it's not nearly enough. But maybe, in a world where young men die for causes they barely understand, in places they can't pronounce, it's the best we can do. Maybe the promise itself, flawed and doomed and heartbreakingly human, is what separates us from the machines that kill us. In the end, nobody is going to die today wasn't just a promise, it was an act of love, a declaration of faith in the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. It was the sound of a human being refusing to surrender to despair, even when despair was the only rational response. Pity that wasn't true, but maybe the pity isn't that the promise was broken. Maybe the pity is that it needed to be made at all. My stories like this remind us that behind every statistic, every casualty report, every strategic objective, there are human beings making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. The Hürtgen Forest was full of Sergeant Vances, good leaders trying to keep hope alive in a place designed to kill it. Their stories deserve to be told, not as propaganda or patriotic mythology, but as honest examinations of what war really costs. That's what we do here. We dig beneath the surface of history to find the human truth underneath. We look for the moments when ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances and had to choose between competing versions of what it means to be human. We examine the promises that couldn't be kept, the hopes that couldn't be fulfilled, the dreams that died in foreign mud. If you believe that these stories matter, that understanding the real cost of war makes us better people and better citizens, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because there are so many more stories like this one, waiting to be told with the honesty and respect they deserve. Stories of courage and cowardice, of love and loss, of the terrible beauty that emerges when human beings are pushed to their absolute limits. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.